and so forth. These stories of simple, superficial, indeed, conflict, they just sell better, and so they get on the screen. In my opinion, the only thing accurate about this film are the names of the people in it. Everything else in it is utter fiction, completely made up. All the dialogue, there's one dramatic scene where Huxley, learning about Darwin's theories, says, "You killed God, sir!" Dramatic, that got put in the preview of the film. Totally made up! Huxley didn't say that. Nobody said that. Okay, so I want to analyze the origins of this story that Annie's suffering and death killed off Darwin's faith. Because when you encounter a story or a version of events, you should always ask, how do we know? Or where does that story come from? How long do people tell you? Well, people have been telling the story of Darwin's life since before he died. He's a famous man, so lots of people told the story of his life. This Annie episode and the role of her death in causing him to leave his faith does not appear until the latter half of the 20th century. And that's a significant point. So the first time you can find anyone mentioning any connection at all between Annie and Darwin's loss of faith is a remark by historian James Moore in 1982. But see how he expresses it as conjecture, which is of course fair enough, it can always conjecture. Perhaps it was the bitter and cruel death in 1851 of the 10-year-old Annie, his favourite child, just a month after he had read the moral challenge to that doctrine in Francis Newman's excellent spiritual autobiography, Phases of Faith, that prompted Darwin, as he later said, to give up Christianity once and for all. This is a rather naughty way of using quotations, because by slipping in that paraphrase, as Darwin later said, it kind of makes it sound like Darwin himself is endorsing this conjecture, when of course it's a quotation taken out of context. Moore revisited this topic of Annie and her role in a later publication in 1989, in a book chapter called Why Darwin Gave Up Christianity. And Annie's death was now the key to his apostasy, that is, his leaving his faith. And it has two main kinds of evidence, if you read this chapter. One is the proximity of Darwin's description of Annie and his discussion of his religious views in his autobiography. He discusses them next to one another. And secondly, he points out that Darwin was still reading books on religion in the 1840s and 50s. So, thereby arguing that he must still have been religious then when he was reading those books. In fact, he quotes one right there, Newman's book, which Darwin marked as excellent in his reading list. Then in the 1991 biography of Darwin, the story of Annie becomes much stronger, much firmer. It's now the cause of Darwin losing his religion. For him, the death marked an impasse and a new beginning. It put an end to 3 years' deliberations about the Christian meaning of mortality. It opened up a fresh vision of the tragic contingency of nature. Annie's cruel death destroyed Charles's tatters of belief in a moral, just universe. Powerful stuff. But there's a lot of conjecture here, based on, well, no evidence. And first of all, let's start at the beginning. From Darwin himself, we have a massive amount of evidence from his life and his writings, his lectures. So there isn't a word in Annie that can connect Annie and her death to Darwin's loss of faith. We know, by his own admission, that he was never particularly religious. But we know he was sort of standard. He was a sort of standard Christian in the Church of England of those days, but not particularly religious. So how did he go from that to being quite openly not Christian anymore? How did that transition happen? So, in his autobiography, Darwin says that it was in 1836 to 9, after his return from Beagle, he began to think about religion, and he began to consider these questions. He wrote, during these 2 years, I was led to think much about religion. And in a journal, now his autobiography is written when he's an old man, looking back. So he made a statement, or he could be twisting this. But at the actual time, in a notebook in 1838, he wrote, all September read a good deal on many subjects, thought much upon religion. Beginning of October, ditto, which means the same. So at the time he said he thought much about religion. Well, More dismissed these dates because he wanted Darwin, he was convinced that Darwin gave up his religion because of Annie and her death. And so these speculations that Darwin says he had, that's misdated, Darwin says. More says. So here's the autobiography as it was published in 1958. So you see there's a section religious belief, and Darwin says, during these 2 years, you see there's a little footnote there, and the date 36 to 39 has been added by Darwin's son, Francis Darwin, who first edited his father's autobiography for publication. And More says, oh, these dates are wrong, they were added by someone else. But I think he's wrong to dismiss those dates because if you look at the actual original manuscript that Darwin wrote, right there, he's added in his own handwriting to this point. I suppose, i.e. 1836 to 39, Darwin has put the dates in himself. So it's not a mistaken addition by his son. There's more argument. Okay, so Darwin's views went from Orthodox Christianity, sometime before and during the voyage of the Beagle, to 1838, when we know that he had doubts. We know this from a conversation he had with his father, which he wrote. He says, before I was engaged to be married, which was November 1838, my father advised me to conceal carefully my doubts. So his father knew, at that time, that Darwin had serious religious doubts. And he advised him, if you get married, don't tell your wife about it. Because as his role as a country doctor, Dr. Darwin, of course, advised lots of housewives on their problems and so forth. And he always had lots of advice. And one of them was, the husband is a skeptic, he should never tell his wife because she'll just worry about him too much. And they might have quarrels, and she'll worry about his soul, and worry about him going to hell, and so forth. So it's far better if he just shuts up and doesn't say anything about it. And so that's what he advised Darwin to do. So clearly, Darwin was already a doubter as early as 1838, because his father advised him not to reveal it to his later wife, Emma. But Emma's letters to him, which survived, showed that he didn't follow that advice. She wrote some very heartfelt letters to him on this subject. And in one of them she regretted that our opinions on the most important subject should differ widely. And she referred to his honest and conscientious doubts. So these are clues. We don't have his letters to her, we only have hers to him. So we don't know what he said, but he obviously said he had doubts. He didn't believe. She wrote, while you are acting conscientiously and sincerely wishing and trying to know the truth, you cannot be wrong, but I believe you do not consider your opinion as formed. So he's still thinking about it at that time. May not the habit of scientific pursuits of believing nothing till it is proved influence your mind too much in other things which cannot be proved in the same way, and which, if true, are likely to be above our comprehension? I should say also that there is a danger in giving up revelation. Aha, there's a clue. Darwin must have said he was thinking of giving up his belief in revelation, meaning the revealed or divine nature of the text of the Bible. Okay, now I think I shared with you before the background of biblical criticism, or maybe a better word is biblical scholarship, during the previous 100 years or so before Darwin's time. And it's essential to understand this backdrop of scholarship in order to understand Darwin's views. his own beliefs. I didn't talk about this before, did I? Yeah. Okay, so I won't go into it too much. But anyway, so Darwin was well aware of these things, and when I show you his comments in a second, you will see they are highly influenced by this biblical scholarship that he was aware of, reading popular books on the subject. So, in his section on his religious belief in his autobiography, if you look at it carefully, most of the reasons he gives for why he lost his faith are what I would call comparative anthropology. In other words, his awareness of other cultures, other religions, other beliefs around the globe, both spatially today, but also chronologically over the course of human history, that there have been so many religions. And Darwin, in that sort of quirky Darwin way, is looking at his own religion and culture from without, considering it just one of many, rather than thinking about it from within, as obviously true, which is what he had done as a younger man. And I think this is consistent with the way he looks at species. Okay, so here are the reasons that Darwin lists. You can find his autobiography online if you want to read more about it. It's not a very long section. Okay, it says, the fact that many false religions have spread over large portions of the earth like wildfire had some weight with me. Okay, that's comparative anthropology. By further reflecting that the clearest evidence would be requisite to make any sane man believe in the miracles of God. Oh, this is a touchscreen. But by further reflecting that the clearest evidence would be requisite to make any sane man believe in the miracles by which Christianity is supported. In other words, there's no evidence could be good enough to prove the miracles that are described it. He says, the more we know of the fixed laws of nature, the more incredible do miracles become. Incredible meaning not credible. That the men at that time, means biblical times, the men at that time were ignorant and credulous to a degree almost incomprehensible by us. That the Gospels cannot be proved to have been written simultaneously with the events, yeah, that's taken from the biblical scholarship, and that they differ in many important details, far too important as it seemed to me, to be admitted as the usual inaccuracies of eyewitnesses. So he concludes by saying, I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true. For if so, the plain language of the text seems to show that the men who do not believe, and this would include my father, brother, and almost all of my best friends, will be everlastingly punished. And this is a damnable doctrine. By damnable doctrine, it doesn't mean Christianity, it means the doctrine of eternal punishment. And this is one of the strongest sentences Darwin ever wrote. He's usually quite a mild-mannered, amiable man. He's angry. He really dislikes that part. In certain times. So he says, by such reflections as these, the ones on the previous slide, I gradually came to disbelieve in Christianity as a divine revelation. And elsewhere he writes, disbelief crept over me at a very slow rate, but was at last complete. The rate was so slow that I felt no distress, and had never since doubted, even for a single second, that my conclusion was correct. Okay, so Darwin eventually was an absolute doubter in Christianity, or indeed in any religion. But notice the way he's described it in these passages. A slow and gradual process of thinking over time, with no distress. Annie's death was the most distressing event of his life. How can you reconcile those two? If her death killed off his faith, and is the most stressful part of his life, how can you describe his loss of faith as slow and without any distress? These seem to me irreconcilable. So here's another question that is often discussed. When did he stop attending church? This is the church in Darwin's village. It's about a 5-minute walk down the road from the Darwin's house. this is how it was today. Obviously, there were no blue cars in front of it in Darwin's day. Now, in this book called Annie's Box, or that's the original edition, the American edition is called Darwin, His Daughter, and Human Evolution. Randall, by the way, is a great-grandson of Darwin. There are lots of Keynesians out there who are descendants of Darwin. Anyway, Randall writes, after Annie's death, Charles set the Christian faith firmly behind him. He did not attend church services with the family, but he walked with them to the church door, but left them to enter on their own, and stood talking with the village constable, or walking along the lanes around the parish. Well, that's a very specific claim, and this was a very successful book. And the film I pointed out to you earlier is based on this book, although loosely based. In fact, Randall was very happy how the film turned out. Moral of the story is don't let people make your book into a movie, because they'll screw it up. But anyway, how does he know that Darwin stopped attending church when Annie died? Again, it's one of these stories that sounds so dramatic that it clicks and it gets repeated and repeated and repeated. But there's only one piece of evidence on which Randall could base this claim. I know what that is, which is that the constable went away as a policeman. A village policeman, many years after Darwin's death, was interviewed by a journalist looking for recollections from old Mr. Darwin, what was it like when you were the policeman in Darwin's village and so forth. And this policeman recalled that Darwin used to walk with his family to church. They would go in and then he would chat with the policeman or walk around. That's the source for this. The problem is that policeman only came to Down Village in the 1870s, 20 years after Annie's death. How can that be used to say that after her death he stopped? You can't. It's completely impossible. It sounds good. And people just cannot resist stories that sound good. No, that's not legal. And also, note here, I don't want to skip over this, that Darwin's wife is a very religious lady. She's like Darwin's mother. She was a Wedgwood, from the Wedgwood family, and was also a Unitarian. This village was so tiny, there wasn't a Unitarian church, so she went to the Church of England and took the children. Darwin, what should we call him, skeptic, free thinker, doubter, non-believer, whatever, had no objections to his children being raised as Christians. It's a bit odd, because this is the third generation of Darwins that have done this. The father is a free thinker, a skeptic, the wife is religious, and the children are taken to church, and the father doesn't do anything to intervene or to impress his own skepticism or whatever on the children. Isn't that odd? I don't know. Okay, now Darwin described his own loss of faith in a larger social context in which we have to consider. It's not just Darwin who's giving up his religion. Darwin wrote, nothing is more remarkable than the spread of skepticism or rationalism during the latter half of my life. So it's, I think, somewhat unreasonable to expect some extraordinary personal event like the death of his daughter to end his faith when it's happening to people all around him who aren't having children die tragically early. There are lots of his friends in his circle are giving up their religion. Should their reasons be any different than Darwin's? I think the biblical scholarship has something to do with it. There is some sort of rising tide of skepticism in this period. I've discussed before what is now considered as a classic genre of the loss of faith amongst Victorians. Happens to a lot of people. Many of them went through this crisis in which they struggled. They didn't want to give up their religion. They didn't know what to do. Oh dear, oh dear. Whereas Darwin describes himself as not having experienced it like that. Obviously, he must have been aware that others did. He said, I didn't have a crisis. It happened slowly and gradually. I felt no distress. But many people did. And we know that Emma, his wife, felt distress Anyway, so according to Darwin's own words, it's his gradual appreciation that his former beliefs were not supported by sufficient evidence, and that the available evidence of many kinds allowed for the belief in a creator as a first cause, but that as far as could be demonstrated by science, this is a quote by Darwin, everything in nature is the result of fixed laws. And remember what's been happening over the previous 100 years. Think back all the way to the first week of this module, the first lectures. Remember that the interpretations of geology and astronomy and so on they've been becoming more naturalistic over time, in the sense that the reliance on natural laws and natural causes have been gradually displacing the belief or the acceptance that divine or supernatural causes were involved in the ordinary course of nature. That, of course, still leaves room for miracles, which are, by definition, outside the normal course of nature. So Darwin is absolutely not original in this belief that he has that everything is run by natural laws. Remember that one of the reasons that Messages, the book published in 1844, was so controversial was because it pushed an extreme version of this doctrine of natural laws, that natural laws control everything, and that's all you need to worry about. So hinting that you don't need to worry about religion or believe in it if you can't say that. But pushing this doctrine, almost like his own religion, or that's, I think, fair to call it a philosophy of natural laws, almost to the extent that he venerated the laws of nature. And that's just one book. Many other people picked up on this and accepted some kind of naturalism as what runs the universe. So Darwin is totally typical of this, not in any way unusual. Okay, so one of the biggest questions is, was Darwin an atheist or not? What do you think? Have you heard that he was an atheist? This is just something I found on Google once. Atheism good enough for these idiots, which has Ernest Hemingway, Abraham Lincoln, Carl Sagan, Einstein, Mark Twain, Thomas Edison, Benjamin Franklin, and right in the center there, our friend Mr. Darwin. Well, I don't know if the others were atheists as much as Darwin was, but as you'll discover, Darwin was not an atheist. So whoever made this poster got it wrong. Usually, I mean, sometimes Darwin is represented as an atheist by atheists because they want a respectable figurehead, right? But probably more often he's represented by an atheist by people who don't like his name or his image or what they think he stands for. So like this sign in America, there's Darwin, and it says, atheist, someone who believes that nothing made everything, a scientific impossibility. And Darwin is the figurehead for this. Or so whoever made this campaign believes that anyway. Okay, so look at this 1879 letter to a correspondent. Darwin writes to him because he was asked about his religious views. Darwin was always reluctant to discuss his religious views. He didn't discuss them in his publications during his lifetime, although they contain many references to the Creator, or our Creator. Anyway, so Darwin answered this person. I have to first say, my views on religion don't matter to anyone but myself. I'm not an expert on this. Many other people are bigger experts than I am. You think I'm a man of science. But if you want my opinion, he says, my judgment often fluctuates. Whether a man deserves to be called a theist depends on the definition of the term. In my most extreme fluctuations, I have never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of a God. I think that generally, and more so as I grow older, but not always, he's always hedging his bets, that an agnostic would be the most correct description of my state of mind. Agnostic. Write that down. Okay, sorry for the long quotes, but these are important. Okay. Darwin writes, another source of conviction in the existence of God connected with reason, not with feelings, impresses me as having much more weight. This follows from the extreme difficulty, or rather the impossibility, of conceiving this immense and wonderful universe, including man, with his capacity of looking far backwards and far into futurity, as a result of blind chance or necessity. When thus reflecting, I feel compelled to look to a first cause, having an intelligent mind in some degree analogous to that of man, and I deserve to be called a theist. Mark that last word, write it down. Theist. So you just wrote down agnostic, and now theist. Which is it? What is a theist? A theist is someone who believes in a God, but it's such a vague term that it can be anyone's God. It doesn't really mean something very specific. If you use the word God with a capital G, you're referring to a specific one, presumably the Judeo-Christian one. But theist is just someone who believes that there is a supernatural being, but not identifying that supernatural being as the one described in the Bible. Okay, so he goes on to say, let's not skip over this point about he finds it impossible to think that this amazing universe is the result of blind chance or necessity. Well, that's what these people seem to think that Darwin says, that everything in nature is the result of randomness and chance. And yet Darwin repudiates that view. He does not think that. So anyway, Darwin goes on to say, this conclusion was strong in my mind about the time, as far as I can remember, when I wrote The Origin of Species. And since that time, it has very gradually, with many fluctuations, become weaker. But then arises the doubt, can the mind of man, which has, as I fully believe, been developed from a mind as low as that possessed by the lowest animal, be trusted when it draws such grand conclusions? May not these be the result of the connection between cause and effect which strikes us as necessary, but probably depends merely on inherited experience? Nor must we overlook the probability of the constant inculcation in a belief in God in the minds of children, producing so strong and perhaps an inherited effect on their brains not yet fully developed, that it will be as difficult for them to throw off their belief in God as for a monkey to throw off its instinctive fear and hatred of a snake. In other words, he's suggesting that belief in God has been inculcated in children for so long, he's suggesting that it's almost become like an inherited instinct. This was, by the way, his wife really didn't like that. She, as many other Christians of her day, liked that Christianity was something that you rationally accepted and embraced, rather than blindly inherited. So there's nothing very like there. Anyway, so he concludes, I cannot pretend to throw the least light on such abstruse problems. The mystery of the beginning of all things is insoluble by us, and I, for one, must be content to remain an agnostic. Notice again, write it down again. Oh, underline. So that's 2 times we've got agnostic, and 1 time theist. Are they the same thing? We'll get to that shortly. But before we do, let's take a 5-minute break. Now, people still use this word today, but with all words, of course, its meaning evolves over time, so it may not mean to you or to people nowadays what it originally meant, but the original definition was that one feels that one cannot know one way or the other whether or not God exists. Let me describe the context of the creation of this word. Huxley is an up-and-coming man of science who wants science to become more professionalized, hopefully to be funded by government and so forth. And of course, these are not idealistic, objective wishes alone. Of course, they're also very personal and selfish, because Huxley was not from a rich family like Darwin, he was from a poor family. I think I told you that he had to wait many years before he could bring his Australian fiancée to the UK and marry her, because he didn't have enough money. And so he was a bit grumpy about it. He was really annoyed that science didn't pay. And that people who were good at science, like him, had to struggle. He felt that science should be a profession. So he and his circle of friends like-minded in this aspect. And he's also someone who is, like a lot of Darwin's other friends, is not religious. But, as I think I told you in a previous lecture, the word atheist in Victorian times was a very bad word. Almost no one would ever call themselves an atheist. I mean, it was just the most evil, horrible thing you could be. So atheist was something you called someone else. He's an atheist. Ugh, absolute scumbag. Atheists were people that, according to rumor or legend, were people who are completely faithless in the sense that they are not trustworthy. Do not trust an atheist because they don't have any religious or moral backdrop to rely on. Whereas the opposite of an untrustworthy atheist would be someone of your religion. So another Christian is someone with whom you can enter into a trusting agreement because you have this you share this common morality and the power or authority that is behind that morality. Because the atheist rejects that, so they're not trustworthy. You can't lend an atheist money or anything. That's the reputation of what an atheist meant at that time. So no one called themselves that. Although by the end of the 19th century, there were people who were starting to call themselves atheists. There was a small atheist movement. There was a larger secularist movement, but not all secularists were atheists. Some of them were indeed Christians, but they just thought that, say, the government and other institutions should be secular. At this time, of course, you remember that Darwin, because he was baptized in the Church of England, that was necessary in order for him to go to Cambridge, or to go to any English university until UCL, University College London, was founded in the 1820s as a secular university in which you didn't have to be a member of the Church of England. You didn't even have to be a believer. It was called the Godless Institution in Gower Street or something like that, because it was considered such a radical idea that a university should be secular. Remember, Darwin had to sign a form swearing that he was an actual member of the Church of England and that he believed in its 39 articles or declarations of belief. The UK, even to this day, still has the state church. The Church of England is the official church of England, not Scotland. And their own church. So, in Darwin's day, the link between the state and the church was very intimate indeed. Also, to be a member of Parliament, you had to be a believer. You had to swear on the Bible. When the first secularist, I think his name was Charles Bradlaugh, when he was elected to Parliament and refused, as a non-believer, to swear on the Bible, they wouldn't let him into the Houses of Parliament. And he was sent packing, and this went on and on for years and years. I think eventually he did finally get it somehow. But anyway, he was the one who tried to break this old tradition that you had to swear on the Bible in order to become a member of the House of Parliament. Okay, so that's setting some background context. So Huxley wants to be respectable. He is respectable. He's a respectable man. He's not, but he's also from this younger, more radical generation with more liberal and more secular views. So when gentlemen ask him at dinner parties or drinks or at the gentleman's club about his beliefs, everyone can tell because he's quite outspoken, unlike Darwin, who's very mild-mannered. Huxley's really in your face with his views. People know that he's not a believer, that he's very critical of religious authorities having anything to say about science. They should keep their noses out. That's Huxley's point of view. So when they ask him, well, what do you believe? What's your view? He doesn't, of course, for a moment consider calling himself an atheist, and probably he wasn't one. So that's completely off limits. There's no way you can use that word. maybe a secularist, a free thinker would have been a word. Funnily enough, Singapore uses this word free thinker, which we gave up using about 100 years ago. Every time someone from the UK hears it used in Singapore, they have a bit of a chuckle, because, oh, I still say free thinker? It's almost completely forgotten. Most people don't even know what it means, but it was in use in this time. So that was also too radical, too severe. Huxley wouldn't choose that either. So he made up his own word, agnostic. And in my opinion, it's a bit of a cheat. What he's saying is, I'm respectable. I'm not an atheist or a free thinker, but I'm also not a believer. In fact, what he's saying is that he's saying plague on both your houses, the religious and the non-religious. And in a way, this is so common, isn't it? He's performing that role of one-upmanship. He's claiming that he's better than everyone else. In other words, he doesn't take a view on that topic because he stands aloof. He is too intelligent and doesn't waste his time on these pointless questions about whether or not God exists or not. That's for other people to argue about. I'm an agnostic, he says. I'm above the question. You see what he's doing? It was very clever. He could avoid being labeled this awful thing, being an atheist, while at the same time declaring himself to be even more respectable than everyone else. Because I don't take an issue in this debate on this topic of whether or not God exists or not. There is not evidence enough for me to decide one way or the other, so I'm outside the topic. Very clever. And this was picked up on by lots of other people. But as you saw, Darwin used the term. But in my opinion, we cannot consider Darwin an agnostic, since he very clearly says he believes in a creator. An agnostic does not believe in a creator. An agnostic says, I don't know how you could know one way or the other. I refrain from judgment on that question. Darwin is not refraining from judgment on that question. He has a belief. There is a creator. That's not an agnostic. So he's using the word wrong. Even though probably he likes it because it sounds respectable. So he uses that word. But he's not. He's a theist. Because he believes that there is a God, a creator. But he definitely doesn't believe in the one told in the Bible, because he has given up his belief in the Bible, or in the truthfulness of the text. He thinks it is, he doesn't come out and say this, but my summary of his views would be that he thinks it's a book of ancient mythology. That's what Darwin probably thinks. Does not believe the stories, doesn't believe the miracles, doesn't think that there's more truth in them than the others. Ooh, actually, I think I skipped a slide somewhere. Anyway, if you read his discussion of religious belief in his autobiography, he talks about, he compares Christianity to other religions. Remember the comment he said before, false religions have spread across the globe like wildfire. So he says that, of course, in Victorian days, it's very politically incorrect. So, of course, you could refer to all other races as savages and all other religions as obviously false. And he's doing that in that passage. But he says, look, all of those other religions are completely false. And look, they've covered huge chunks of the globe. Why should mine be any different? So he's generalizing about the religion of his own country, of his own religion. Those were unfounded and they spread. Why should mine be any different? Just because one of the arguments people gave was that, look, Christianity is so widespread, there's so many Christians in the world, because it's true. And Darwin is rejecting that kind of argument by saying, well, no, there's loads of religions, and we don't believe in any of those other ones, so why should that be evidence for mine or for this one being true? So this is a little cartoon drawn by Huxley in a letter to Darwin, in which he's kind of making fun of Darwin. A German professor has written to Huxley. Huxley's German, and has begged Huxley, oh, dear Professor Huxley, could you perhaps have an introduction to meet Mr. Darwin? He is my hero. Something like that. And Huxley is now making a joke and drew this little sketch, imagining the German professor kneeling before Darwin and swinging a censer of, what's in the censer? The smokies that coming up called? Incense, thank you. Yes, so waving incense in Darwin's face, and so being blessed by Pope Darwin. In fact, Huxley's actually written selection on the staff. He's making fun of Darwin, and people are revering him as an almost godlike figure. Of course, Huxley and Darwin's other friends debated him that they didn't seriously. Darwin himself certainly wouldn't have seen himself that way, but he was seen that way by many. Okay. Now I'll discuss this interview that Darwin had with Edward Aveling near the end of Darwin's life. I think it was in 1880. This man, Aveling, was an atheist. He's the first one that we have encountered, I think, in this course. He really was one, and he really called himself one, and he was quite, he was an advocate, and he was absolutely against religion and against belief in God and so forth. So he wrote pamphlets and he propagandized in favor of atheism and secularism and so forth, and against the power of Christianity. So anyway, he got somehow got himself invited to lunch at Down House with a visiting German who was also an atheist. I think they knew Darwin's son. These aren't the sort of people that Darwin normally hangs around with. In fact, to spice things up, Darwin invited the vicar, the priest of Down Village, to lunch the same day, so that they would all be sitting around the lunch table together. Darwin hated that sense of humor. And then, of course, as they did in those days, after the meal, the ladies went and did lady things, and the gentlemen retired to another room to smoke and drink or something like that. Anyway, so that's when the real serious conversation starts. And Darwin goes right after that. So why do you call yourselves atheists? And what about the word agnostic? Isn't an agnostic just an atheist, rich, respectable? In other words, isn't an agnostic just an atheist but in respectable language? This is what Aveling says. And an atheist is only an agnostic put in aggressive terms. And Darwin says, but why should you be so aggressive? Is anything to be gained by forcing new ideas on people? Free thought is all very well for the educated, but are ordinary people ripe for it? I might think Darwin's a bit arrogant there. He is. He's saying these forward-looking views are okay for the intellectual elite, but probably not right for the common prolls. And anyway, so then Darwin admits that Christianity was not supported by evidence. That's totally consistent with his remarks in his autobiography and elsewhere. But then he said, I never gave up Christianity until I was 40 years of age. Okay. Well, James Moore, the historian I mentioned earlier, he uses that quote to back up his Annie theory, or Annie hypothesis, that it was her death. 40 is a bit too old for the Darwin giving up his religion just after the publication of the Beagle. I think these things are not consistent. We have quite a lot of evidence that he was thinking about religion and gave it up after the voyage of the Beagle by considering that there wasn't enough evidence. And then this remark, saying I didn't give it up until I was 40. These are quite far apart. How to make sense of that? My interpretation of this sentence is that, remember he's talking to a stranger. He's not one of his friends. I think what he meant by this is public observance. In other words, stopped going to church when he was 40. I think he had inwardly given up his belief long before, and probably continued going through the motions of going to church on Sunday because that was just the respectable thing to do. Anyway, that's my interpretation, but it's just an interpretation. We know from one of Darwin's sons, I believe it was Francis Darwin, was in the room during this conversation, and he later wrote that Mr. Abelin gives quite fairly his description of my father's views, even though my father did not share Abelin's views at all. In other words, Darwin was not a rabid atheist or a secularist, or indeed didn't want to push his own religious views on others. He thought that was a private affair, private matter. And certainly his views were private. As far as the world should be concerned, they shouldn't be a matter of concern for anyone. But of course, because of Darwin's influential position, starting after the reception of The Origin of Species, he was so famous, and he was so highly regarded, even by critics. Even critics had the highest respect for Darwin, because he took objections seriously, he was of the highest authority and scientific achievements and so forth. So he was very, very respectable and super famous, and now everyone attributed to him that he had almost single-handedly brought about this great revolution in science, i.e. evolution. And so, for many people, that meant that his views were of the highest interest. They wanted to know, what did he think about God and so forth. He's the man who's convinced the international scientific community that evolution is a fact. But he does mention a creator. And he doesn't talk about how life began. Did it have a supernatural beginning? Darwin never says. So people have been debating and discussing his views ever since. Not that it should really matter whether Darwin was an atheist or not, but for very many people in the world, it does matter a lot. So the new atheists today, like Dawkins and his friends, I think they really wish Darwin wasn't an atheist, because he is their big authority. And I noticed Dawkins is very slippery and never referring to the fact that Darwin was a theist and not an atheist like Dawkins. I'm sure Dawkins wishes that Darwin was, or maybe he's not aware of it, because he's not a historian. Such people often refer to Darwin's views. So Darwin himself believed that the world was full of an unbelievable amount of misery and suffering. This is what his theory is all about. The struggle for existence is constant. Death, carnage, destruction, and suffering, blood spilling, murder are happening every single second of every day. That, Darwin says, is the order of nature. It is not a benevolent, happy design. It is not a peaceful, smiling nature. It is a bloody, cruel, heartless nature. That's the image that Darwin sees, and it's the kind that has, I think, prevailed in the scientific community since. So I've got 3 very short video clips from my usual stock of David Attenborough documentaries, which make this point. I want you to imagine that this is the kind of thing that pervades Darwin's thinking, that nature is not happy, and it's not nice, it's nasty. And some of you may find these clips a little bit shocking. So you've been warned. Look away if you can.
No. Ý lại nội dung.
They're beginning to drift away. She starts her sprint. Now she's running flat out. She's bounding so swiftly that her feet are off the ground for almost half the time. She's almost flying. The race is over. The slowest will not compete again. are the fastest thing on four legs. Their backbones are so supple that their hind legs can reach forward on either side of the front. She's so slim and agile, she can rival a gazelle in dodging and swerving. Unusually, another has come to share her prize. It's probably a grown-up cub from last year's litter. She wouldn't tolerate anyone else. Her slim, athletic build is now a liability. Heavier animals like lions could push her off her kill, so she and her cubs eat fast. All big cats are widely distributed. The complex males do their best to fight back, but the chimps are much bigger and stronger. Some of the infants have been separated from their mothers. They're now easy prey. But it's not over yet. The male colobus fight to defend their families. But they couldn't save this infant.
Oh my god. Monkeys and monkeys.
The hunters found them.
Eat the monkey.
The rest of the group joined them. The males are the first to eat. They supplement the flesh with a few leaves, just as humans take vegetables with their meat. But some of the male hunters now share their kill with other members of the group, including the females.
They can eat all parts.
Do they get anything in exchange? Sex, for example? This male is certainly mating with one of the females. But then he allows a different female to take some of his meat.
She got that deal.
Perhaps the meat is given to those who beg the hardest. Pork pie is certainly trying his luck. One insect after another. Time after time, he's spurned. But eventually, his persistence pays off. But the...
Okay, one more.
Chimpanzees and monkeys.
This is the okay. This is the really shocking one.
Ah, seriously? I have a very good impression of whales.
But it's killer whales.
I think they're quite cool. I always wanted to see one.
Maybe to separate
Oh
hide
my
from
god.
flesh.
They eat seeds? I didn't know.
But very often, the successful hunter takes its victim straight out to sea without even killing it. And there it plays with its catch as if it were exulting in triumph.
Oh, that asshole, oh my god.
all the food it needs, and in a whale must catch at least 3 sea lion pups a day. And every day, throughout the breeding season, this group of skilled, highly intelligent hunters do just that.
I feel like they're not being unconscious or something.
Oh, he's such an asshole.
Yeah, I think it's like
Yes, so
Yeah,
it's
they don't
things,
give up.
it's images like this that Darwin has in mind. That he insists that nature is hopelessly wasteful and cruel, given the Malthusian point about the number of offspring, of seeds, pollen grains, eggs, whatever it is that are born, produced, whatever, every year, countless billions constantly being produced, and almost all being killed or destroyed. So it's a nasty nature. And indeed, he said, he found some consolation that this staggering amount of pain and suffering in the world is the result of laws of nature rather than the direct will of God. Because he thinks that if it was a divine plan that nature should be so full of pain and suffering and so forth, that this would be a very nice view. But the fact that it's simply a consequence of the laws of nature, he says as well, some consolation. It's not meant. There was no divine purpose or reason why it should be so. Nature should be so cruel. That's Darwin's view. After all, he says, if nature was benevolently and kindly designed, we wouldn't see this kind of suffering and so forth. We wouldn't see that a cat plays with a mouse. That's actually one of my own cats. With a mouse that she caught. Look at the look in her eyes. She's sort of got it. And do you know what they do? My cats would always do. If they caught a mouse, they would take it out to the center of the lawn, which is as far as possible from any place where a mouse could get away, and release it, and then wait for it to run again. And if it didn't, it would, after a while, get a bit impatient. Whack, whack. Come on, go for it. I dare you, come on. And eventually, the mouse would dart off, and the cat would pounce on it again. Ha ha, got you. Go again. And do it over and over again to recatch the mouse with their massive, to the point of view of the mouse, the cat is a gigantic monster predator with teeth so big that it can just simply bite through its entire body instantly if it wanted to. But the cat takes, obviously, some people might say this is anthropomorphizing, but I reject that. The cat clearly takes huge delight in catching. That's why cats like to play, right? A piece of string or a toy or something. They like something small moving rapidly that's just out of grasp. And just being able to catch it gives them huge pleasure. And nothing gives them more pleasure than catching something that's alive, like a mouse or a bird. I had one cat that would bring birds alive into the house and let them go. Because it knew they couldn't fly away and they could chase them over and over again. What a mess of feathers that made. But anyway, I've seen the mouse thing many, many times. The cat would take it out and let it go and just keep catching it over and over again until the mouse, you can actually see its little heartbeat pounding thousands of times per minute, terrorized. It's blood full of fear, and it is being played with to death because the cat takes pleasure. And other animals do this as well. That's what the whales were doing. Right? They were clearly having fun smashing cute little seals. Right? Is there any other interpretation? They were smashing. What about that belly flop? Tons of whales smashing down. They were having fun being cruel to their prey. And I wouldn't say that the cat is not as smart as a whale. I think they're consciously being cruel, but they are being cruel by virtue of the fact that they love catching a small prey that is trying to escape. But the mouse just sits there, doesn't move, doesn't do anything. It's not fun. Come on, go, come on. And then eventually when the mouse does, the cat delightedly catches it again and again. Okay, this is a Victorian print, which was, I don't know how many of these were sold, but anyway, the cartoons represent all sorts of people in the political and religious spectrum of the day, and the different types of religious positions that were available. So it's a discussion of Christianity in England in those days. So there were people who were quite liberal, there were those who were very conservative, and all sorts of different versions. And Darwin and his friends are represented up in the top left corner there. Darwin, again, is being represented as a monkey, saying, "This way to daylight, my sons." In other words, he's suggesting that the cartoonist is suggesting that Darwin and his friends see themselves as enlightened figures, leaving behind the darkness of superstition. Here's another version, I think, of the same cartoon. Here again, so there's a picture of Darwin at the top of the hill there. So the cartoonist is linking Darwin to some kind of scientific or rationalist enlightenment. But I want you to understand that this is just one part of the spectrum of religious or non-religious beliefs or views in Victorian times. Right? Not everyone thought this way. After all, of course, since people were far more religious on average in those days than most people on average tend to be these days. And yet Darwin's theory was widely accepted. So for many people it was not a problem to accept Darwinism and to keep their religion. And I've stressed that over and over again, because that's the biggest part of the picture, and it tends to be overlooked. But on the other hand, I don't want to make it sound like that's the only version of the only view at the time. Because of course, there were other people who thought that Darwinism put an end to religion. There were secularists and atheists like Abeling and others who took Darwin as their figurehead for their non-religious views. Okay, so here's another one of these cartoons. You can see Darwin as a secular son of the 19th century, spreading enlightenment by reading the world of bishops, the Bible, and priestly hobgoblins. So you can see these ghostly figures represent priests in the church. So the one with the big round hat, I think that's probably either a Jesuit or some sort of Catholic, and there's a Bible there. So again, this is that sort of extreme version of Darwin followers. Here's another one. This is from I can't actually remember the name of the magazine. It's at the top there. I think it's called The Truth Seeker was the name of this magazine, which was by either atheists or freethinkers of some sort. So again, this is a minority view, extreme view, but what they've represented here is Darwin in the position of the referee in a boxing match between, and they're making jokes here, okay? Great prize fight for the championship of the world between Jehovah, the celestial crusher, and Beelzebub, the pet of pandemonium. So they're caricatures of God and the devil, right, getting ready to have their endless fight between good and evil. And who's standing there adjudicating in the middle? They put Darwin there with his Origin of Species under his arm. Now Darwin would have hated this. He was dead by the time this was published, but this was not at all the role that he wanted to play. He didn't want people to associate him with any side of the religious spectrum, even though we know very clearly what his own opinions were, that he was a non-believer in Christianity. I hope this is clear. He's not an atheist. He believes there is a God that has designed the laws of nature, probably. But he's not a Christian anymore. He does not believe in any of the details or the doctrines of Christianity. So you might find it somewhat ironic that when Darwin dies in 1882, he was not buried in his local churchyard as he had expected. but instead was buried in Westminster Abbey, which is basically our national church. It is the most prestigious place that someone could be buried by the establishment. I hate using that word, but it does sort of fit here. Darwin, what is he? Agnostic, free thinker, whatever he is. People know that he's not a good Christian. It's privately held. But then he ends up being buried in Westminster Abbey. One of the few men of science to get a state funeral. When he died, he expected that he was going to be buried in the local churchyard, like the rest of his family. But Huxley and others soon got in interaction on this question and lobbied to have Darwin given this state funeral and to be interred in the national church. What this shows you is the ultimate reconciliation between the official Church of the State, the Church of England, accepting Darwin literally, accepting his body and interring him, which is a mark or a stamp of total approval, isn't it? He's not someone who is so controversial or considered wicked or irreligious that he would not be given this honor, but instead the church quite eagerly takes him on. And he's buried not far from Isaac Newton. This is Westminster Abbey today has rather unrealistically well illuminated. It doesn't really look that nice. Okay, now there's a very widespread story out there in the world, especially on the internet, that Darwin had some kind of deathbed conversion back to Christianity. You will find this repeated thousands of times around the internet. And these claims go back to a specific lady who was a very, very extreme evangelical lady. And she claimed that she visited Darwin at his home near the end of his life and that he was reading the Bible when she came in, and she attributes various statements to Darwin, which if I read them, I think, what the hell, this is completely bonkers. It doesn't sound like Darwin at all. It sounds like an evangelical lady, since of course she made it up. She made up this dialogue. But when she was giving these talks in America to evangelical audiences, of course they loved it. Ah, yes, Darwin finally saw the error of his ways, and basically, in short, said, "Oh, evolution, never mind. I take it back," and converts to Christianity again, becomes a believer again. Why is this story so widely circulated and so widely repeated, even though it is not true? Because clearly it matters to some people that they wish it was true. But it's, I think, very poor logic. It doesn't matter whether Darwin continued to accept his theory or whether he continued to remain a non-believer. Does it? And it doesn't make any difference to the truthfulness of his science. But it matters a lot to a lot of people, which is why it's so widely repeated that he took it back. He rejoined the fold of Christianity. He accepted that he was wrong, and so. Oh, by the way, the actor in that picture right there is Ronald Reagan. It's the only picture of a deathbed scene I could find on the internet. So this is a drawing that was done of Darwin's study shortly after he died. It was all left exactly the way he had left everything. Some people drew it, other people photographed it. He was already venerated as a great man by the end of his life, and hence the retelling of his story really began with his death. Usually in those days, people will refrain from talking about his religious beliefs because that wasn't really very polite to talk about what he believed to believe. So it was not mentioned in the early days. When it came time to publish his Life and Letters, edited by his son Francis in 1887. Francis wanted to publish the entire autobiography, including the discussion on religion, with all those remarks that I shared with you, including that really powerful line that this is a damnable doctrine. There was a huge row within the Darwin family about this. Emma and her daughter Henrietta were strongly against these passages being published, and they almost went to court over it. The fight was so serious. They thought that these remarks about religion, in a way these skeptical remarks, why Darwin didn't believe, why he thought it was not true. They thought these things were private. Darwin never intended for them to be published, which is true. The autobiography was written for his family. It was not written to be published or written to be read by the public. They thought they needed to protect Darwin's image as a respectable Victorian gentleman and man of science. If his skeptical and almost scoffing views on Christianity and religion in general were to become known, they thought this would damage Darwin's image. After all, look, he's buried in Westminster Abbey. So a compromise was reached, and the more sensitive passages were omitted from the published version. And then only in 1958 was the complete text published by Darwin's granddaughter, Nora Barlow, who was early Darwinist. She published a lot of important manuscripts from Darwin's life. So then, from that point on, we have the full text of what Darwin wrote. So, here's some common viewpoints by these, say, 1870s or 1890s that many people share, right? That God or a creator made the universe and the laws of nature, which are so perfect that they need no further interference. That was already a very old view. Darwin's theories showed that biology too, like astronomy, chemistry, geology, and so forth, was under the control of natural laws, not under the control of the divine being. Humans were descended from earlier forms, like all other animals and plants. But perhaps God, or a creator, had then given humans something special, like a soul, or our mind, or something that made us different from other animals. But most people would accept evolution, like gravity or the roundness of the Earth, was established and was no longer debated. So I'll remind you of this passage. Darwin writes, "I see no good reason why the views given in this volume should shock the religious feelings of anyone. A celebrated author and divine, but divine as a priest, has written to me that, quote, he has gradually learned to see that it is just as noble a conception of the deity to believe that he created a few original forms, living forms, as to believe that he required a fresh act of creation to supply the voids caused by the action of his laws." I've shown you this quote before, but I want to underline the fact that this is Charles Kingsley, was the celebrated author and divine. He was a clergyman, and that was his view on reading Darwin's book. Remember, everyone by then was very aware, far more so than we are, because it was new. The knowledge of the succession in the geological record, that there had been an endless story of species appearing and disappearing. And Kingsley is saying, surely it is a better, more noble view of God to think that he designed the system in such a way that all those gaps, in other words, all those extinctions that have been happening endless millions of times throughout the history of the world, all those gaps are being naturally filled by things evolving to fill the empty space, rather than God having to consciously create something new in the gaps, which is a view that people had had before, and some people probably still held that view at the time this was written. Right? But Darwin's answer was that what is the origin or the source of new species? They're descended from earlier ones. So I hope I've made these abstruse topics somewhat clear to you. For further reading, you might want to have a look at this website about the Darwin Correspondence Project. And that's it for today. I'm here to answer questions.